The late afternoon sun filtered through the skeletal branches, scattering light across the gravel path like shards of gold. Autumn had painted the park in shades of rust and amber, but to Eleanor Hart, everything looked washed out, like the colors had drained away long ago. She walked slowly, her polished heels clicking in a rhythm that felt too loud for such a still place. A navy wool coat hung from her shoulders, tailored to perfection, but even that couldn't disguise the frailty that had crept into her frame over the past year. It had been 12 months since Daniel died. 12 months since the world had tilted and never righted itself. People said time healed, but time in Eleanor's experience was nothing more than an endless stretch of empty days. The park had been their place. Sunday strolls, laughing over the sound of leaves crunching underfoot, sharing pastries from the corner cafe before heading home. Now she came here alone, without pastries, without laughter, only memories that pressed against her like the chill in the air. Today she almost didn't come. She had spent the morning staring out the tall windows of her penthouse, coffee going cold in her hands, debating whether it was worth stepping into the world. But something, perhaps a stubborn fragment of her old self, pushed her to leave. She turned down the path toward the lake, past joggers and young couples who seemed to exist in another reality entirely. The breeze carried faint scents of roasted chestnuts from a vendor near the gate. Eleanor barely noticed. Her gaze was fixed ahead, as if searching for something she didn't know how to name. And then she saw her. A small figure sat on a weathered bench beneath a sprawling oak. A girl no more than 10 or 11 with dark skin, hair that tumbled in uneven waves around her face. She was hunched over, a battered sketchpad balanced on her knees, her pencil moving in quick, deliberate strokes. Eleanor slowed her pace, curiosity flickering despite herself. The child's coat was too thin for the weather, the fabric frayed at the cuffs. Beside her, a small plastic bag lay on the bench, holding what looked like an apple and a bottle of water. For a moment, Eleanor simply watched. There was something arresting about the concentration on the girl's face, the way she seemed to carve out her own little world in the middle of the bustling park. It stirred something in Eleanor she couldn't quite name, a mix of tenderness and a pang of recognition, like she'd stumbled upon a scene from a life she used to know. The wind picked up, scattering a few leaves across the path. The girl didn't look up. Eleanor adjusted her gloves and kept walking, telling herself she wasn't here to linger, wasn't here to feel. But as she passed the bench, the girl glanced up, and their eyes met. It was only for a second, but it was enough to make Eleanor's steps falter. There was no fear in the girl's gaze, only a quiet, steady awareness. As if she'd been expecting her all along. Eleanor hesitated, her breath visible in the crisp air. She should have kept walking, there was nothing here for her, no reason to stop, but something in that unwavering gaze tugged at her like an invisible thread. The girl shifted slightly, making room on the bench without saying a word. It was a small gesture, but it felt oddly inviting. Eleanor took a careful step closer. "Hello," she said, her voice softer than she expected. The girl nodded once, her hands never leaving the sketchpad. Her pencil danced in quick arcs and careful lines, as if the world beyond the paper barely existed. "What are you drawing?" Eleanor asked. The girl paused, then turned the pad so Eleanor could see. It was a picture of the park, a surprisingly detailed one, down to the ripples on the lake and the curls of smoke from the chestnut cart. In one corner, a lone figure stood on the path. The resemblance was unmistakable. "That's me," Eleanor murmured, startled. The girl's lips curved into the faintest smile, though her eyes still held that quiet seriousness. "You looked like you belonged there," she said. Eleanor didn't know what to say to that. She glanced at the thin coat again, the frayed edges, the way the girl's shoes looked too small. "What's your name?" "Willow." A short answer, but there was a steadiness in the way she said it, like she was used to giving nothing more than what was asked. "I'm Eleanor." Willow nodded, returning to her drawing. The pencil's tip had worn down to a stub, and Eleanor noticed the way the girl held it carefully to keep it from breaking. "You spend a lot of time here?" Eleanor asked. "Sometimes," Willow replied. Then after a pause, "It's quiet. People don't bother you much." Eleanor thought about that. A park full of strangers had always felt lonely to her, but maybe for Willow, it was safer than wherever she was coming from. A breeze swept through, scattering a page from Willow's sketchpad onto the ground. Eleanor bent to retrieve it before it could blow away. It was another drawing, this one of a small house with a broken fence, a swing hanging from a leaning tree. The lines were softer, almost wistful. When Eleanor handed it back, Willow slipped it into the back of the sketchpad without a word. Something in Eleanor ached. She couldn't place why, but she felt as though she'd stumbled into the edges of a story she wasn't meant to see. Eleanor was about to stand and excuse herself when Willow suddenly tore a sheet from her sketchpad. The sound of paper ripping was sharp against the muted hum of the park. She kept her eyes down as her pencil moved quickly, shading, smudging, adding a few careful strokes. Then she set the pencil aside, folded the paper in half and held it out. "For you," she said. Eleanor blinked. "For me?" Willow nodded. "It's a card. I make them sometimes." Eleanor hesitated before taking it, her gloved fingers brushing the girl's smaller, cold hand. The paper was warm from Willow's touch. On the outside, a hand-drawn cluster of flowers bloomed in soft, careful color, pinks and yellows blending into each other like sunlight through stained glass. Eleanor traced the edges with her eyes, surprised by the detail. "May I?" she asked, lifting the fold. Willow gave a small shrug, almost shy now. Inside, in neat, deliberate handwriting were the words, "Some people leave but the love they gave you stays. Don't be afraid to keep it." Eleanor's breath caught. Her hand trembled slightly, though she tried to steady it. She had seen those words before, years ago, written in a note Daniel had left her during one of his business trips, tucked into her suitcase between a silk blouse and a book she'd been meaning to read. She had never told anyone about it. She looked up at Willow. Where did you hear this?" The girl tilted her head as if the question puzzled her. "I just write what I feel. Sometimes the words come on their own." Eleanor didn't reply. The words on the card felt like they'd crossed years and lost to reach her. She closed it gently as though afraid it might vanish if she moved too quickly. A gust of wind rustled the leaves overhead, and Eleanor knew she couldn't just walk away, not now. Eleanor sat back on the bench, the card still in her hands. She read the words again, silently mouthing them as though tasting something both familiar and impossible. "Some people leave but the love they gave you stays. Don't be afraid to keep it." The handwriting was neat but unpolished, the letters slightly leaning into each other. Yet the message struck with the force of a memory she had been avoiding for far too long. Daniel's voice came to her, warm, steady, the kind of voice that could calm her even in the middle of a storm. She saw him again in their old kitchen, writing with a pen that left a faint smudge on his fingertips. He had slipped that note into her suitcase the night before she flew to Paris for an art gala. She had found it in the hotel room, tucked between silk and paper, a whisper from home. She had kept it for years in her jewelry box, unable to throw it away even after his passing. "Why did you write this?" she asked finally, her voice quiet but urgent. Willow swung her feet gently beneath the bench, looking away toward the lake. "Sometimes I think things and they just turn into words. I put them in my cards. People like it. Makes them smile." Eleanor shook her head slowly. "No, Willow. These words, someone very dear to me said them once. A long time ago." Willow glanced at her then, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "Maybe he wanted you to remember." The simple way she said it made Eleanor feel as though the air had thinned. She studied the girl more closely, the unbrushed hair, the too thin coat, the way she held her sketchpad like it was the most precious thing she owned. "How long have you been making these cards?" Eleanor asked. "A while. Since before." Willow's gaze dropped to her lap. "Before what?" "My parents," she said simply. 2 words, no elaboration. Eleanor's chest tightened. She recognized the tone, flat but not because it didn't hurt. Flat because it hurt too much. She had used that same tone in the months after Daniel died, when she was too exhausted to explain herself to well-meaning friends. "I'm sorry," Eleanor said. The girl gave a small nod, as if accepting condolences she had heard many times before. "They liked when I made things. Mama always said it's better to give someone something you made yourself. That way they feel Scene. Eleanor turned the card over in her hands. The drawing on the front was vibrant, almost alive, a stark contrast to the faint chill settling into her bones. "You know," Eleanor said softly, "this is the first gift I've received in a very long time." Willow tilted her head. "Don't people give you things?" "Yes, but," Eleanor paused. She thought of the expensive wine bottles, the bouquets from distant acquaintances, the charity gala trinkets handed to her because it was polite. Not like this. Not something that feels like it matters. The girl's eyes softened, though she didn't smile. "Then keep it." Eleanor studied her for a moment longer. There was something uncanny about this meeting, like she had been walking through the park toward it without knowing. She didn't believe in signs. Not really. But now, she wasn't so sure. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint laughter of children playing somewhere behind them. Willow turned back to her sketchpad and began to draw again, her pencil whispering over the paper. Eleanor sat there, the card resting in her lap, feeling the weight of it grow heavier with each passing minute, not from the paper but from the truth it carried. She knew she couldn't leave this girl here and pretend they were strangers. The card stayed in Eleanor's lap, her fingers tracing the edge as though afraid it might vanish if she let go. Around them, the park carried on, joggers passing, children chasing a bright red ball, the faint hiss of the chestnut vendor's cart, but none of it reached her. All she could hear was Daniel's voice, low and warm, the way he used to speak when they were alone. He had been a man of few words, but when he spoke from the heart, they lingered like music. That note in her suitcase had been one of those rare moments, a gift she had tucked away like a treasure. Now years later, here was a stranger, an orphaned child, offering her the same words unprompted. She wondered if Daniel would have smiled at the coincidence. No, he wouldn't have called it a coincidence at all. He would have said it was the universe nudging her toward something. "Do you believe," Eleanor said quietly, "that people can leave messages for us? Even after they're gone?" Willow paused in her drawing. "I think maybe they can. But not like writing letters. More like, they put things in the world for us to find. Things that make us remember." Eleanor studied her. For someone so young, the girl spoke with a kind of knowing that made her seem older than her years. It wasn't the rehearsed wisdom of a child trying to impress. It was lived in, born from pain. "When my mama died," Willow continued, "I kept finding feathers. Everywhere. She used to collect them. Said they were little pieces of angels. I don't see them as much now, but maybe she gave me all the ones I needed." Eleanor felt her throat tighten. She thought of the park bench where she and Daniel used to sit, the way the autumn light caught his smile, the chestnut cart they would visit before heading home. She had avoided those memories for so long, afraid that touching them would break her apart again. But now, sitting here, she realized they hadn't vanished. They had simply been waiting, like feathers scattered along her path. And here was one more. "Willow," Eleanor said softly, "you've given me something I can't repay." The girl glanced up from her sketchpad, her expression calm but unreadable. "You don't have to. My mama said love is like a circle. It always comes back." Eleanor's chest ached at the simplicity of it. She wanted to ask more, about Willow's life now, where she stayed, who looked after her, but she hesitated, unsure if she had the right. Instead, she let the silence linger between them, a gentle, shared stillness. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked and its owner laughed. The world went on. But for Eleanor, the moment felt suspended, as though the air itself had thickened to hold it in place. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel entirely alone. And she knew, though she couldn't yet see how, that this meeting was only the beginning. The bench felt like an island, anchored in a sea of motion. People passed by in waves, laughing couples, parents wrangling toddlers, students with earbuds and takeaway coffee, but none of them seemed to touch the quiet space between Eleanor and Willow. For a long time neither spoke. Eleanor watched as the girl's pencil moved steadily over the paper, shaping something new. She noticed the faint tremor in Willow's small hands, the kind that came from cold or hunger, or both. "You're very talented," Eleanor said at last, her voice low so it wouldn't shatter the stillness. Willow shrugged. "It's just drawing. Anyone can do it if they practice." Not like this, Eleanor replied, meaning it. You see details other people miss. The girl didn't answer, but there was the faintest flicker in her eyes, something that looked like pride, though she tried to hide it. Eleanor leaned back, tilting her head to watch the branches above them sway against the pale sky. She could feel the familiar heaviness pressing at the edges of her chest, the grief that had become her shadow. But here, with this strange self-contained child beside her, the weight felt less sharp. Not gone but softened. The breeze carried the faint scent of roasted chestnuts again, mingling with the earthy smell of fallen leaves. Daniel had always loved autumn for that, the season of endings that felt like beginnings. Eleanor's eyes shifted back to Willow. The girl sat with her ankles crossed, the sketchpad balanced carefully on her knees. Her coat hung loosely from her shoulders, the fabric worn thin at the elbows. Eleanor found herself wondering where she would go after this, whether there was a safe place waiting for her or just another cold corner of the city. You come here alone? Eleanor asked gently. Mostly, Willow said without looking up. No one worries where you are? The pencil paused for a fraction of a second, then continued. Not really. Eleanor didn't push. She could feel the walls Willow had built around herself, and she knew what it was like to need those walls to survive. But she also knew how exhausting it was to live behind them. The silence returned, but this time it didn't feel empty. It felt deliberate, as though both of them were quietly acknowledging something they didn't yet have the courage to name. A gust of wind sent a swirl of leaves dancing at their feet. One landed on the bench between them, its edges curling inward like it was folding into itself. Willow reached out and tucked it into her sketchpad without a word. Eleanor smiled faintly. Keeping it? It might be important later, Willow said simply. The answer startled her, not in its meaning, but in the way it felt like a truth she had once believed herself. She didn't realize it until much later, but in that small act, two strangers sitting in shared silence, holding pieces of the present as though they mattered, they had already begun stitching something back together. The leaf was still tucked inside Willow's sketchpad when Eleanor spoke again. Willow, the card you gave me, it feels like it came from somewhere. Somewhere deeper than just something you thought of. The girl kept her eyes on the page, but her pencil slowed. Sometimes I think of my parents when I draw. The words, they just sort of show up. Like they're whispering them to me. Eleanor's breath caught. You mean you hear their voices? Willow shrugged. Not like real voices. More like, I remember how they made me feel. Then the words happen. The girl's tone was quiet, matter-of-fact, but Eleanor could hear the ache beneath it. She waited, not wanting to push, and after a moment Willow began speaking again, still drawing as she talked. They died in a car accident last year. I was staying at a neighbor's house that night because Mama had to work late. The police came in the morning. The pencil stopped entirely now. She set it down and folded her hands in her lap, her fingers curling into the sleeves of her coat. After that, I stayed with my aunt for a little while. But she said she couldn't take care of me anymore. So now I'm at St. Mary's home. Eleanor felt something deep in her chest shift. She'd heard of St. Mary's, an overworked shelter for children. Not dangerous but far from warm. They let you come to the park alone? She asked carefully. Willow nodded. Sometimes. I told them I like to draw outside. It's easier than staying in my room with all the noise. And nobody there really notices if I'm gone for a few hours. Eleanor swallowed. She wanted to say that's not right, wanted to march into St. Mary's and demand answers. But she also knew this moment wasn't about her outrage, it was about listening. And the cards? She asked softly. Willow's gaze lifted for the first time, meeting hers. Mama taught me to make them when I was little. She said store-bought things are nice, but handmade things carry a piece of the person who made them. After she died, I kept making them. I guess so I wouldn't forget how. Eleanor looked down at the card resting in her lap again. It wasn't just paper and ink, it was a fragment of this child's love, stitched together from memory and grief. The wind ruffled Willow's hair, and Eleanor had the sudden urge to reach out, to smooth it back, to offer some kind of comfort. But she kept her hands folded, afraid to break the fragile trust between them. Instead she said, "Thank you for giving me one." I don't think you know how much it means. Willow tilted her head, her eyes calm but searching. Maybe I do. And for a moment, Eleanor wondered if she did. Eleanor sat in silence for a long moment after Willow's words. The hum of the park swirled around them. Distant laughter, the faint bark of a dog, the rustle of wind through brittle leaves, but all she could feel was the weight of the card in her lap and the gravity of the girl beside her. She thought about how she had come here today with no real plan, just a half-hearted intention to walk off her restlessness. Yet somehow, her steps had led her straight to this bench, to this girl, to these words that had cracked something open inside her. She looked at Willow again, small, thin, her coat too light for the season, and felt a knot of protectiveness tighten in her chest. The idea of the child returning to St. Mary's, to a place where no one noticed if she disappeared for hours, made Eleanor's stomach twist. "Willow," she began slowly, "what would you say if there was another place you could be? Somewhere warmer, safer?" The girl blinked at her, eyes narrowing slightly in cautious curiosity. "Like where?" Eleanor hesitated. She had not thought this through, not the logistics, not the legalities, but she knew she couldn't ignore the feeling growing in her. "With me," she said finally. "Just for a little while. I have a home, and I could make sure you have what you need." The words hung in the air between them, fragile as spun glass. Willow didn't speak right away. She studied Eleanor's face, as though measuring whether she meant it or whether it was just something people said when they wanted to feel kind. "You don't even know me," Willow said at last. Eleanor nodded. "That's true. But I'd like to. And I know enough to see you deserve more than what you've been given lately." The girl's gaze flicked to her sketch pad, then back to Eleanor. "What if I don't fit? People don't usually keep me around for long." Eleanor's throat tightened. She thought of her own life since Daniel's death. Empty rooms, quiet dinners for one, the echo of footsteps in hallways that used to feel alive. "I think," she said softly, "maybe we'd fit just fine." For the first time since they met, Willow's expression shifted. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was close. Something hesitant, like a door cracked open after a long time shut. "You'd have to ask the people at St. Mary's," Willow said. "They make the rules." Eleanor nodded again, but her mind was already working. Names of lawyers she trusted, friends on charity boards, ways to make this happen. The wind stirred again, lifting a curl of Willow's hair across her cheek. Eleanor resisted the urge to reach out, instead folding the card carefully and slipping it into her coat pocket, close to her heart. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but one thing was certain. She wasn't walking away from this bench without a plan. The next week unfolded in a way Eleanor could never have predicted. The morning after meeting Willow, she called St. Mary's home. The conversation was short but telling. Yes, Willow was one of theirs. Yes, she often went to the park. Yes, they were underfunded and over capacity. Eleanor heard the unspoken truth in the woman's weary voice. They couldn't give Willow the attention she deserved. By the end of the week, Eleanor had met with the director, filled out temporary guardian paperwork, and invited Willow to visit her home. It was meant to be a trial arrangement, but deep down, Eleanor already knew it wouldn't be temporary. The first evening, Willow stood in the foyer of Eleanor's penthouse, her small frame swallowed by the high ceilings and polished marble floor. She clutched her sketch pad to her chest like a shield. "It's big," she said, her voice quiet but edged with awe. "It's just space," Eleanor replied gently. "It's not worth anything unless it feels like home." Over the next few days they settled into a tentative rhythm. Willow drew at the long dining table in the afternoons, often leaving a finished sketch by Eleanor's place setting at dinner. Eleanor in turn found herself cooking again. Simple meals at first, then dishes Daniel used to love, recipes she hadn't touched in years. The house began to change. It wasn't immediate, but the silence that had once felt oppressive now seemed filled with life. Pencil scratches from the dining room, the soft hum of Willow's voice when she spoke to herself while drawing, the clink of spoons against mugs of hot chocolate. One evening, Eleanor walked into the living room to find Willow curled up on the couch, sketching by the fire. The girl looked up, her eyes reflecting the flicker of the flames. "Do you think," Willow asked, "it's okay to be happy again, after bad things?" Eleanor sat beside her. "I think it's more than okay," she said. "I think it's what the people we've lost would want for us." Willow considered that, then went back to her drawing. "Mama would like you," she said after a pause. The words settled warmly in Eleanor's chest. For the first time since Daniel's death, she felt as though the jagged edges of her grief were softening, not because the loss was gone, but because something new was growing around it. Later that night, she passed the framed photograph of her and Daniel in the hallway. She paused, touching the glass lightly. "I think you'd like her too," she whispered. Restoration, she realized, didn't happen all at once. It happened in quiet, ordinary moments, in shared meals, in the sound of laughter returning, in the sight of a small figure sketching in the glow of a fireplace. And Eleanor knew she was ready to keep building those moments. A month after that first meeting in the park, Eleanor found herself in her study, the morning light spilling across her desk. She had been rearranging picture frames, photographs of Daniel, of her travels, of moments that had once defined her life. But now there was a new addition: the card. She had placed it in a simple wooden frame, the kind that didn't distract from what it held. The hand-drawn flowers on the front were still as bright as the day Willow had given them to her. Inside, those words, Daniel's words, were visible behind the glass. "Some people leave, but the love they gave you stays. Don't be afraid to keep it." Eleanor set the frame on the shelf above her desk, next to the wedding photo she and Daniel had taken under a canopy of autumn leaves. Somehow the two belonged together, side by side, a bridge between past and present. "Whatcha doing?" Willow's voice came from the doorway. She padded into the room, her socks mismatched, her hair still mussed from sleep. "Just finding a good place for something important," Eleanor said, gesturing to the shelf. Willow walked over, peering at the frame. "Looks nice there." She didn't say anything about the words inside, she didn't have to. Eleanor smiled. "It's more than nice. It's a reminder." They spent the rest of the morning together in the kitchen making pancakes. Willow's were oddly shaped, sometimes lopsided, but Eleanor pretended each was a masterpiece. The air filled with the smell of butter and syrup, and for once, breakfast was not something to be rushed through. Later they took a walk in the park, the same park where they had first met. The trees were nearly bare now, their leaves scattered across the ground in a golden carpet. Eleanor noticed how Willow's steps seemed lighter, how her eyes searched the world with a quiet curiosity instead of guarded caution. As they passed the old oak bench, Willow slowed. "This is where you looked sad," she said softly. Eleanor nodded. "And this is where you changed that." Willow tilted her head. "I just gave you a card." "You gave me more than that," Eleanor said, kneeling so they were eye to eye. "You gave me a reason to remember that life can still be beautiful. And you reminded me that love doesn't end when people leave us." Willow looked away for a moment, her cheeks pink from the cold. "Maybe you gave me something too." They didn't need to name it. As they walked back toward the gate, Eleanor felt the crisp air fill her lungs, and for the first time in over a year, she didn't feel like she was simply passing through the days. She was living them. The card on her shelf would remain there, not as a relic of grief, but as a symbol of what had been restored. Love, she thought, really does come full circle. If this story touched your heart, remember, sometimes the smallest steps lead to the biggest changes. Subscribe and join us for more stories that prove compassion can change the world.